Good morning, friends. Welcome back. All of you, especially those who are coming from outside. It is a pleasure to see you all here. And today we are going to explore this subject, human reflection of the cosmic logos. When I chose the title, I thought that it was appropriate, but after these few days of deep study and scholarship, I realized that it's not quite technical, that the audience is more learned, and I can use a more technical term or title for this talk. So I decided to change it. The Big Bang Theory. Which is what it is. David has created a school now of thought. Seriously now. We have seen this subject from several points of view. From the metaphysical point of view in the first day, then from the mystical point of view that David brought beautiful imagery from Christianity and Hinduism. And I think now we are going to explore this subject from the occult point of view. So first let us see why we should study this kind of subjects. I always like to point this out because this is, the direction, why or how we should approach all this. So these are some quotes from Damodar Mavalankar. He was an early theosophist, and he was a disciple of the masters and a good friend of Blavatsky and Olcott and the founders. So he says, how can we etherealize ourselves, meaning spiritualize? By obtaining knowledge of the forces of nature. In one word, by studying occultism. And just as one step leads you to certain progress, more knowledge will lead you to a greater progress. Now, this knowledge, of course, is, as we are going to see, is the foundation for an occult life. And we are going to define what I mean by occult life. The knowledge by itself is not enough, but knowledge of this aspect of the universe and our life is necessary to lead this kind of life. So he goes on and says, before a person can have the privilege of being admitted as a chela, even as a disciple of the masters of the wisdom, he has to pass through a succession of lives and prepare himself theoretically for the task. According to Western notions, this may sound very strange, but nevertheless it is a fact. The man has to study theoretically first and develop within himself the germ of adeptship before he can ever hope to approach the secret sanctuary in any capacity. The idea is that you have probably all seen this in the theosophical movement. Some people come to your group and they immediately have a grasp of the teachings, not necessarily from a technical point of view, but they get the spirit of them. They recognize them as being true. Whether they are true or not, I'm not trying to make a dogmatic statement, just the experience of them recognizing them as true. And then there are some other people that they have really a hard time to accept them, to understand them, and again, not at an intellectual level, but you can see that sometimes the soul seems to be approaching these teachings for the first time, and in other occasions there is a recognition of something that the soul already knows. Because everything that we study, especially at the level of spiritual teachings, this wisdom is retained by the soul. And life after life, the soul brings that knowledge innately. Then we need to meet on the physical plane the teachings again to remember. It's a reminiscence, to put words into all these feelings, intuitive feelings that we already had. But the soul needs to grow into this particular understanding of the universe, life after life, before that person can become a helper of nature, a co-worker of nature, as we are going to see. As Damodar says in the next quote, the more he studies and understands the actions of the forces of nature, the more is he in a position to benefit humanity. So we are talking here about a different dimension of our spiritual journey. There is an aspect of spirituality in which we are trying to discover who we really are, what life is about. But there is another aspect of the spiritual path that has been highlighted by the theosophical teaching, and that is that what is meant to produce through the theosophical movement is people that can help in the growth and evolution of humanity and the whole creation, all the kingdoms around. And for that, obviously, we need to first master matter in all its manifestations, physically, emotional, and mental. We have to get to a point where we are not enslaved by our thoughts, emotions, and physicality. And then we have to learn how to master matter outside of ourselves. This is the occult path. This is what HPB called theurgy. Theurgy was a word used by Neoplatonists, especially Iamblichus, and it has to do with magic, if we want to call it that way, and with the ability to interact with the spiritual entities on a spiritual level. So for that, we need to purify ourselves, and we need to learn to raise our consciousness and become part of the creative forces in nature. So Blavatsky says, theurgy has to be preceded by a training of our senses and the knowledge of the human self in relation to the divine self. So we have to train our senses, we have to become more sensitive gradually and naturally, and we have to discover the unity, the identity of our human self with our divine source. And she goes on and says, so long as man has not thoroughly mastered this preliminary study, it is idle to anthropomorphize the formless. So many times the idea of theurgy is turned into a kind of worship of spirits or entities. And that is because the person doesn't really perceive the spiritual aspect of this, that we as human beings are part of the hierarchy of spiritual beings. So first, we need to have a sound understanding of our relationship to the Logos, to all the hierarchies. And she says, knowledge of the inner meanings of these hierarchies and purity of life alone can lead to the acquisition of the powers necessary for communion with them. So the knowledge of these hierarchies, the inner meaning of them, not just looking at them as angels that are there to bring us something or to pray to, and the purity of life that we need to be able to be in tune with these spiritual entities, then we can develop the ability to commune with them. In the Secret Doctrine commentaries, there is a little dialogue between Blavatsky and Bertrand Kigley. And Blavatsky was saying that we can only perceive this aspect of the universe through our higher self. So Kigley says, yes, unless we can raise our consciousness, we cannot in any way enter in a direct perception of them. And then Blavatsky corrects him and say, why are you talking as if you were separate from them? Why don't you consider yourself a hierarchy, one of these hierarchies of beings? And if you see in the Secret Doctrine, the human monads are part of one of the creative hierarchies. We could see ourselves as an angelic hierarchy, if the word angels is more familiar to us in the West, a kind of host of angels that are going through what we call the human experience, because there is a certain mastery of the lower planes that has to be gained. We are not this person, we are not this personality. This is the external code, the means for us as a divine hierarchy to learn and master the lower plane. So we are the true fallen angels. We are the angels that fell into matter, of course, for a cosmic purpose. So what we are going to do in this talk is to try to see how we are an integral part of the hierarchies, and how the idea in the theosophical view is that the cosmos is a kind of hologram where each part reflects the whole. So the whole host of hierarchies of beings, and which they are the expression of the logoi, are ourselves, are in ourselves and are ourselves. And we are going to see a little about that. So then Blavatsky says that the study of the esoteric sciences has a double object. First is to prove that man, and remember when she says man, she's talking about the thinker. Man comes from the Indo-European root man, from which the Sanskrit word manu, for example, comes to, and it means the thinker, in the sense not necessarily the psychological thinker, but the state of evolution that we call human is a state in which the process of thinking is present. The process of thinking is not in animals and is not in angels, in the Anchohans. They are beyond the process of thinking. The characteristic of a human being is the development and the purification and the spiritualization of this process of thinking. So this is why in theosophy we talk about man. Man is not supposed to be the male or the female. In time, because of our culture, we identify the word man with males, but the idea of man is the totality. So when you read theosophical texts and you see man, it's saying humanity. So we were saying the double object is to prove man to be identical in spiritual and physical essence. Both spiritually and physical, we are identical with both the absolute principle, Parabrahman, and with God in nature, with the Logos. So physically and spiritually, we are identical with these two principles. And the second object is demonstrating the presence in us of the same potential powers as exist in the creative forces of nature. So because we are essentially identical with the logoi and with the absolute principle, all these powers of nature, the powers that create the universe or manifest the universe, are in us. We are, as we are going to see, an emanation of these powers. And even if we are not aware, we are exercising these powers at a particular level. We are going to see all this. So Blavatsky says, let us then study man, but if we separate him for one moment from the universal whole, or view him in isolation from a single aspect apart from the heavenly man, the universe symbolized by Adam Kadmon, we shall either land in black magic or fail most ingloriously in our attempt. Some people complain that when we talk about theosophy, we always start by the most difficult part, the cosmic, the absolute. Most modern spirituality focuses on the personality and what the personality can do, how it can manage the emotions, the thoughts. And that is okay, but that's just a very preliminary approach. Because what happens is that if we focus our attention on the personality with no awareness that this personality is just the last link in what we really are, then we either begin to become selfishly interested in the personality and the development of powers and this and that and fall into black magic, or we cannot really understand our place in the universe. So in theosophy, we always start from the universal, because that is what we really are. And then we see how we come to be on this plane, this particular body, rooted on the universal. It's not that we have a soul floating up there. It's that the soul we are that soul or the spirit, and that soul is taking a body to express itself on the physical plane. So it's the reversal of what normally we regard ourselves. So now, Blavatsky, let us explore the idea of the macrocosm and the microcosm. You know, the macrocosm is what we would call the universe or the cosmos or the solar system. There are some, in general, Blavatsky said that when she talks of all these forces and hierarchies, she's talking about the solar system, the solar logos, and all the hierarchies that belong to our system. And the microcosm would be we as human beings. And both of them, one is a reflection of the other. So the microcosm is a reflection of the macrocosm. And she uses this well-known mantra, Buddhist mantra, Om Mani Padme Hum, which means literally the jewel in the lotus. And she says this mantra esoterically signifies, oh my God within me. And she says, yes, there is a God in each human being, for man was and will re-become God. The sentence points to the indissoluble union between man and the universe, for the lotus is a universal symbol of cosmos as the absolute totality, and the jewel is a spiritual man or God. So the lotus is a universe, and the jewel that is in the center is a divine spark. Or then we can apply it to our personal being, and we could say that the lotus, in a reflection to, you know, in theosophy there is the idea of reflection where the higher or the highest is reflected in the lower, and the middle in the lower part of the middle. So we could see the lotus as being the personality, and the jewel as being Atman, or the higher self in us. And then she also takes another allegory, which is interesting, and she says, our principles, the 7 principles that constitute us, are the 7-stringed lyre of Apollo, truly. You know this myth, the idea is that Apollo created, or actually got, a lyre that was magical. When he would sing songs with the lyre, he could even create things. So Blavatsky says our principles are like this instrument, but she says in this our age, when oblivion has shrouded the ancient knowledge, man's faculties are no better than the loose strings of the violin. So they cannot produce any music, therefore any magic. Magic again in the mature sense, not just Harry Potter magic. But the occultist, who knows how to tighten them and tune his violin in harmony with the vibrations of color and sound, will extract divine harmony from them. The combination of these powers and the attuning of the macrocosm and the microcosm will give the equivalent of the invocation Om Mani Padme Hum. So the idea is that all the powers are potentially in us, but we are out of tune with the universe because we are using our powers for selfish reasons, and these powers are very feeble in us because the strings are very loose. So first we have to attune ourselves with the universe. How do we use the powers that we already have? Look at the world. If a person has intelligence, what's the normal way of spending that intelligence? Of course, in having a great career, making money, enjoying life. Few people think of putting their intelligence for the service of humanity. Or if you have money, or if you have time, or if you have whatever faculty, the natural tendency of a human being is to use any faculty that is in them to produce a nice life for himself, regardless of the whole. So the first thing we have to do in the occult path is to start turning our attention to the whole and attuning our powers, whatever we have, with the universal purpose. And once we do that, then we can start learning to tighten the strings so that these powers become more and more stronger and stronger, but they will be used for the benefit of the whole. If we don't do that, then we become a black magician. We develop this power, but we are still using it for selfish reasons. So in theosophy, you will see always that there is a strong emphasis on purity and the purity of motive, and not in developing the power first. That is a wrong approach. Many people come and say that they want to learn how to meditate, for example, a technique that will produce anything that they may be looking for, peace of mind, or kundalini, or astral travel, and that is a completely opposite approach to what theosophy is proposing. First, we have to purify ourselves to see where we should go, to discover, not because Blavatsky says it, or anybody else. We have to study and think and discover where we should go before we start moving. If we start moving in the wrong direction, the faster we go, the further away we are getting from where we should go. So first, we have to go in the right direction and then start moving, walking and then eventually running, if you will. So then in the Secret Doctrine commentaries, Blavatsky says, when we speak of men, let us remember that it is a perfect analogy, that which we call Parabrahman and the first Logos is in man, Atman, and Buddhi. Then, as we begin by the third Logos, so we must begin with Manas, because there it is where the point of differentiation begins. So she's doing this parallel. We have Parabrahman, we have the first Logos, and then the second that we have seen is many times skipped, and then we have the third Logos. And in the same way, we have Atman as a ray of Parabrahman, and then we have Buddhi as a symbol of the first differentiation, the first Logos, and then we have the third Logos as Manas. Sometimes you will also see that the analogy is drawn in a slightly different sense. Parabrahman, Atman would be related to the first Logos, Buddhi to the second, and Manas to the third. And again, these analogies, I remember in one of Blavatsky's writings, she was, I think, relating Alaya, which is the sixth cosmic principle, to Buddhi, and then she relates it to Atman in some other place, and somebody complained and said, hey, this is contradictory. And Blavatsky said, you really don't understand how correspondences work, because they are applied in different ways according to the context that you are using. In some occasions, as David talked about, the gods have different names, different qualities, and these are not really discrete, separate principles. So in some occasions, Buddhi represents the second Logos. In some other aspects, it represents the first. So we have to keep this in mind. Of course, at the beginning, it's difficult to cope with this, and we want straightforward things and fixed things, but occultism doesn't work in that way. So we have to be patient and ready to be flexible. And she says, Mahat corresponds to higher manas in man, and divine ideation, which would be this potential ideation that starts with the first differentiation, is Buddhi. One is the mind, whether of cosmos or man, the cosmic and the human soul, and the other, the divine ideation and Buddhi, the spiritual soul in the universe, the macrocosm of man, its microcosm. So this is a little example of how the logoi match with the human principles. And in ourselves, we are going to see it a little later, but our manifested logos is our higher manas. So that's what we have to worship, in quotation marks. That's the aim of our process of evolution right now. But then, once we become aware on that level, we have to worship the first Logos, and eventually the absolute Parabrahma, meaning Buddhi and Atman. So we are going to see that in the last talk. But the idea of these correspondences is not only metaphysical, but they are actually, as we have already said in the past, these days, they are a map for the way back to our true being. Oh, okay, so this is a little messed up. Let's see. So we have here a diagram just to show. I try to put, although I'm not talking much about the demiurge and the tetragrammaton, it's without the I, tetragrammaton. This is just to show how the cosmos reflects in the human being, according to what HPB said, para Brahman is Atman. Then the first logos and mula prakriti is buddhi. Buddhi tends to be seen as a feminine aspect, as a passive aspect, at least before manas unites to buddhi. So perhaps mula prakriti, which is at the level of the first logos, would be a good correspondency for buddhi. Then mahat is the higher manas. And then the demiurge, which is the god of the lower planes, can be related to the lower manas, to our mind. We are the demiurge of our own cosmos. If you see the Gnostic myth, the demiurge awakens in a universe and is not able to perceive the higher planes, Sophia, that was his mother, and he awakens on these lower planes and says, hey, I am God, I can create a universe, let us create a universe. And he creates a universe on his own, and of course he's flawed, he's not complete, he's a fragment of the reality. So the universe that he creates is a flawed universe, it's not a good universe. So then he creates human beings that were devoid of spiritual understanding. So Sophia has to come and put a divine spark in human beings so that they can free themselves from the kingdom of the demiurge, which is like a prison. So all this is a reference to our lower mind. When we don't recognize our origin, and just as in this culture, we think that the lower mind is the god of creation. We think we can do anything, we can understand anything, and in science, in politics, look at the world we are creating. So we are, as humanity, we are a cosmos that is being ruled by this flawed demiurge. And we have to recognize the divine spark so that we can go beyond it. And the tetragrammaton are the lower planes in the cosmos. Let me see the quote that we had there. I don't know if it is really important. Trying to. Okay, so Blavatsky says in this quote, the 7 principles are derived from the 7 great hierarchies of angels or Dhyani-chohans, which form collectively the manifested logos. So we have seen that we have the third logos, which emanates 7 hierarchies of beings, of celestial beings, which will emanate in turn 7 hierarchies and a whole cascade of 7-fold emanations. So she says that all our principles derived from all these different hierarchies of beings. We are a collection, if you want to see it in that way, a collection of hierarchies in which we as a monad are evolving. For example, this physical plane, you can see it as the body and the consciousness of one particular hierarchy of being. We are as physical entities, we are cells in this Dhyan-chohan, the physical Dhyan-chohan, if you want to put it that way. So we are made of the body of this Dhyan-chohan, and our physical consciousness is part of the consciousness of this Dhyan-chohan. Of course, individualized, personalized, we have to expand this consciousness until it becomes one with the Dhyan-chohan. And this on all the levels. So we are living, evolving within these hierarchies of beings. So this is why Blavatsky says that each of our principles derived from the Dhyan-chohans, they are part of them, and we are part of these Dhyan-chohans. So in one of her writings, she talks a little about this, this emanation and the reflection of these principles in human beings in terms of the hierarchy. So far, we have seen how the logoi reflect in our principles, but always remember that the logos is actually a hierarchy of beings. It's not one single God, one single consciousness. So she says the first hierarchy exists as the uncreate power, Atman. The second is generated in the dark waters of space. Chaos, or the undifferentiated substance, are Buddhi. From or through the image of the former, reflected, the former mean the first hierarchy, reflected in those waters, the image of him or it, which moves on them, the third world, or in man manas, will be endowed with every power of that eternal and omnipresent image if it but assimilates it to itself. Typical long sentence of Blavatsky. So the idea is that we have this uncreate power, we have the undifferentiated waters, the primordial matter. This uncreate power reflects itself in the waters or in the mirror, as was explained before by David, and then this produces the first real manifestation of the uncreate power with all, potentially all the powers there of the uncreate principle. And then it says that the image, this image, manifested image, has to assimilate those powers. See that there is always this idea that we have the powers, but somehow they are not activated or not assimilated, they are potential in us. For all is eternal, pure and incorruptible. All that is eternal, pure and incorruptible is concealed in everything that is, if only potentially, not actually. And everything is that image, provided the lower image, man, ascends to the highest source and root in spirit and thought. So this is the first point. We have the potential powers of all the hierarchies, of all the creative powers in the world, in the universe, and then we have to attune ourselves to the universe and awaken these powers. This is the path of occultism. And before we can actually do that, we have to have the right view. You know, in the Buddhist path, in the Eightfold Path, the first one, the first quality that we have to acquire is right view. So this is, for the occult path, the first thing we have to acquire is right view. Otherwise, it's dangerous and it will take you in the wrong direction. So all the study that we do, this is remember I said, the first aspect of the theosophical study is to change our perspective of life so that we can take life as a spiritual experience, as a spiritual training. The second aspect is as a form of yoga. Through this study, we can begin to awaken our higher mind and our intuition, because these kind of things can only be truly perceived through our higher senses. And then this is a third aim of the theosophical study, that is to set the foundations to become a co-worker of nature, to become an occultist, a disciple of the masters, and not from a personal ambitious point of view, but as a servant for humanity. And that may happen in any life, in this one or the future. What I mean is that it doesn't matter when. What we are concerned with right now is to set the right foundations, and when it happens, it happens. So Blavatsky says, having read the foregoing, students will now better comprehend the necessity of first studying the correspondences between our principles, which are but the various aspects of the triune, spiritual and physical, man, and our paradigm, the direct roots of these in the universe. So she's highlighting why we have to study all this. And in view of this, we must resume our teachings about the hierarchies, directly connected and forever linked with man. Okay, so the view that Blavatsky proposes, there is a nice diagram. Let me show you first. The view that Blavatsky proposes is that each hierarchy could be thought of as a color. And so you have the blue hierarchy, the green hierarchy, etc. Now, each one of these hierarchies, as we said, have 7 or emanate 7 more hierarchies. So the blue hierarchy, if we want to call it that way, has within itself all the colors, but they are filtered by the blue quality. So you will have a yellow that is bluish, a green that is bluish, then the bluish blue, that would be the essence of that hierarchy. And the same with any other hierarchy. Every hierarchy contains within itself all the hierarchies, and you can see this more or less in astrology, how the planets going through the signs, they assume like a different color. So this is not too different from that, and actually Blavatsky talks about it. So she says the 7 prismatic colors are direct emanations from the 7 hierarchies of being, each of which has a direct bearing upon and relationship to one of the human principles. And then she says each of the primordial 7 hierarchies, are the first 7 rays forming the manifested logos, is again 7-fold. That's what I showed in the diagram. So then she says each hierarchy furnishes the aura of human beings of one of the 7 principles with its specific color. Further, as each of these hierarchies is the ruler of one of the sacred planets, it will easily be understood how astrology came into existence. These hierarchies are connected with the planets, the sacred planets, and therefore those planets have an influence on us, not so much at the physical level, but because the hierarchy that ensouls that planet is not out there. At the level, on the inner planes there is no space. So the hierarchy that ensouls that planet is also furnishing ourselves with a particular principle. And according to the moment in which we are born, what hierarchy was more active is what principle in ourselves will be more active. So some people have some particular emanation from one of these hierarchies more active than the other, or they work in a particular way. So astrology is the external symbol of an occult fact. And then she says every man is being born under a certain planet. There will always be a predominance of that planet's color in him, of that hierarchy, because that principle will rule in him, which has its origin in the hierarchy in question. So this gives you the idea of the interconnection that there is in the whole cosmos, or at least within the solar system, and how everything is really one being that is expressing in different forms. Here is an example of how the hierarchies gives us the different principles in man. So this is a diagram that Blavatsky designed. The blue, let's start from the top. The yellow represents Buddhi, and it comes from the yellow hierarchy and the yellow sub-hierarchy within it, number 5 in this case. This is supposed to be the yellow hierarchy. In this diagram, whichever color is wider is the color of the hierarchy. And if you see the line, it comes from the color, the particular color of that hierarchy. So then you have the higher manas, which is the blue triangle that comes from the blue hierarchy and the blue sub-hierarchy within. And then the green is the lower manas with the little connection to the higher, that is the antahkarana. The downward 5-pointed star is kama, the kamic principle. Then the orange is prana, and the violet is the etheric double. And then in light blue you have the auric egg. So this is just a diagram to show that. Now if we look at this, we can look at this now from the point of view of emanations. This theory of emanations tells us or explains why we have the powers of the hierarchies, but they are limited. So talking about the Gnostic teaching of Simon Magos, he was an early Gnostic teacher, and using his writings to exemplify this, she says that the great manifested thought proceeded on the second or intermediate plane to create inferior hierarchies. So you have the third logos, suppose, and it emanates on the inferior planes. And Blavatsky would say the planes in the Gnostics are actually two of our planes. You know, each plane is two of our planes. So the intermediate in the Gnostic system, or at least in his, there are three planes: the highest, the middle, and the lower, which you can divide in two each and get to the 7 planes that we know in theosophy. So the third logos emanates a lower hierarchy to the middle plane to create an inferior kind of hierarchies, which in their turn created, or rather emanated, out of their own essence, our world with its men and beings over which they watch. It does follow that every rational being, called man on earth, is of the same essence and processes potentially all, and possesses potentially all the attributes of the higher eons, the higher hierarchies, the primordial 7. It is for him to develop with the image before him of the highest, by imitation in actu, means by actually or actualizing these powers, the potency with which the highest of his parents or fathers is endowed. So the idea, you can think of this as a ray of light that is coming deeper and deeper into a lake. At the beginning is very bright, at the bottom is very dim, but the ray is the same. So all these hierarchies is one being that is going deeper and deeper into matter. On each plane, this being has a different name. The hierarchy blue, the hierarchy green, but it's one being, it's the logos that is being emanating itself or submerging into matter, and at the very bottom it becomes a human being. So we are the hierarchy on the physical plane. Now the light is dim at the bottom, and meaning that it's potential, but we can make it bright by activating it, and we are going to see that aspect now. So again, some other example of this, the 7 primeval gods or angels, are Dhyani Chohans, are formless at the upper rung of the ladder of being, materializing more and more as they descend in the scale of objectivity and form, ending in the grossest and most imperfect of the hierarchy, man. So again, you see that it's clearly said that we are a hierarchy on the physical plane. Not only on the physical plane, of course, our principles come from the highest plane, but she's talking to us in this waking state of consciousness, in the state of consciousness we are right now. So at this point, we are that hierarchy working on the physical plane. So it is the former purely spiritual group, the highest hierarchy, that is pointed out to us in our occult teaching as the nursery and fountainhead of human beings. So the idea is that the highest hierarchies have the monads, the human monads, within themselves. We are the cells of this highest hierarchy, and these hierarchies watch over the development of human beings. But again, when we talk in this way, it looks like the hierarchies are different from us. This is very difficult to put in words, because we are trying to put this in words that belong to the physical plane, when one thing denies the other. So you can see it from a certain point of view as if we were, that this hierarchy would be our Father in heaven, but on the other hand, we are that particular hierarchy experiencing the physical plane. We are not different from it. So here Blavatsky explains again that as we descend, we keep the same potentiality of the highest. And she says, and this is what we are going to explore a little now, to be equal in all things, again explaining the Gnostic system, to be equal in all things to the infinite potency, the eons, these hierarchies, had to imitate this infinite potency in its action, and becoming themselves in their turn emanative principles, as was their parent, giving life to new beings and becoming potency in act to themselves. So she says there is this, the highest principle emanates a lower hierarchy. Now this lower hierarchy has all the potentialities of the higher principle, but they are potential, therefore it's like they are not there. To become like the Father, these hierarchies have in turn to emanate, to give birth to a lower hierarchy, let's say, and then in doing that, they become as the Father. They actualize their powers. So she says to produce emanations or to have acquired the gift of Kriya Shakti. Kriya Shakti is the power of thought. The power of thought, again, we are talking about cosmic hierarchies, so it's a cosmic power of thought. The universe is created by the power of thought, or what we would call thought on that high plane. So Kriya Shakti is this force by which they create a lower hierarchy. And so this is the direct result of that power, an effect which depends on our own action. So typically from HPV she's talking about the hierarchies, and suddenly now she's talking about human beings, because we are the same on different levels. So she says that that power then is inherent in man, as it is in the primordial eons, and even in the secondary emanations, those in the middle world, by the very fact of their and our descent from the one primordial principle. So again here she talks about Kriya Shakti, and she says that the builders create the world through Kriya Shakti, and the second paragraph says this is the power of producing forms on the objective plane through the potency of ideation and will from invisible and indestructible matter. So we have this idea in the New Age that we create the universe around. In general, the New Age takes many of their ideas from theosophical sources mainly, and from some others, but they are understood in a very superficial way. In general, there are many things in the New Age, but the typical understanding is quite limited and quite narrow in terms of time. Of course, there will be a transformation of humanity. Probably a few, according to what kind of transformation you are talking about, it can be in a few thousand years, or millions, or billions, if you are talking about the next round. The theosophical teachings talk about all this. But then they take that teaching, and that will happen in 2012. Or now they are looking for a new, date where this will happen. And the same with these powers. All these powers are in human beings. That doesn't mean that right now, without being trained, without being pure, we really create the physical world. This interpretation of quantum physics that I personally don't believe too much, that everything is a potentiality or it's just something that may happen, and we with our mind are collapsing the waves and creating the universe. If that were true, the world would be far more a chaos than it already is. Because we are very foolish in what we create, and we would be creating all kinds of little monsters. And yes, a yogi, for example, can precipitate a physical object. We have that example in HPV and many others. That power is potentially in us, but fortunately, it's not in every single human being. That power can be developed naturally only when we purify ourselves and we awaken the higher consciousness. Sometimes we can develop those powers without purifying ourselves, and then we have the black magic. But yes, although the creative powers are in us, that doesn't mean that we can right away create things on the physical plane. However, we are constantly creating on a different plane, because remember, the logos, the third logos, is the creative logos, and our mind is the logos. Our lower mind is the demiurge, the creator of the lower universe, and that's what we are. So this is a quote from the Mahatma letters, and the master says, every thought of man, upon being evolved or thought, passes into the inner world and becomes an active entity by associating itself with an elemental. So we think we produce a force which ensouls or is ensouled by an elemental kingdom, which is in a process of evolution. That is to say, and he defines elemental, one of the semi-intelligent forces of the kingdoms. So this thought survives as an active intelligence, a creature of the mind's begetting, for a longer or shorter period proportionate with the original intensity of the cerebral action which generated it. So a strong thought will produce an entity which will last for a while, and this entity is a living being. It's a hierarchy that we are emanating, if you want to put it that way. Thus, a good thought is perpetuated as an active, beneficent power. So it can actually do good in the world. Good thoughts, by thinking good thoughts, we generate a lower hierarchy, lower in terms of evolution. The elementals are lower than us in terms of evolution. So we emanate this lower hierarchy, which becomes a power in nature. It can be a power for good or a power for evil. So an evil one will be as a maleficent demon. And so man is continually peopling his current in space with a world of his own. Everything we create is still connected to us, just as the hierarchies that emanated us are connected to us, are within us, within, not at the level of space, metaphysically speaking. So all these thoughts, all these elementals that we send out there, they are within our aura, not again in terms of space, magnetically speaking. So people are current in space with a world of our own, crowded with the offsprings of our fantasies, fancies, desires, impulses, and passions. A current which reacts upon any sensitive and nervous organization which comes into contact with, in proportion to the intensity. So any sensitive entity that comes in contact with us comes in contact with our creation. And by any, we mean the vegetable kingdom, the animals, or other human beings, possibly the mineral kingdom too. So then he says, the Buddhists call this skandha, and the Hindu gives it the name of karma. And then he says, the adept evolves these shapes consciously, but we normally throw them off unconsciously. So we are unconscious creators or emanators of these lower hierarchies of beings, which then go into the world and generate the world that we have. So when we say, when somebody like Krishnamurti or many others say, you are the world is a result of what you are, it's an occult truth. It's not just, a mystical or allegorical way of saying these things. We are actually creating the world by this indirect means. This is why the voice of the silence says, ere thou canst near that goal, the spiritual temple, let's say, thou must have mastered all the mental changes in thyself and slain the army of the thought sensations, meaning the lower thoughts, the personal thoughts, that subtle and insidious creep unasked within the soul's bright shrine. So you can see what Blavatsky called the auric egg, our field of consciousness, as the soul's shrine. And then the thoughts that come into our field, and because we identify with them, we give them strength and we emanate these lower hierarchies. They creep into the temple and then we produce them. And the idea of Jesus expelling all the thieves and the people who were doing business in the temple is a metaphor for what we should do in our own temple. We have to generate a state of awareness so that every time that an unworthy thought or emotion comes into our temple, we can expel it, we can reject it. By rejecting, I don't mean repressing. The first thing we have to do is not to take ownership of it. We have to be able to watch it as it comes, because all these thoughts, only pure thoughts really come from the higher ego. The higher ego is beyond all the stupidity of human nature or lower human nature. The thoughts that come to us that are pure, spiritual, they come from the higher ego. All these other thoughts that we have normally, they are part of the consciousness of humanity. They enter into our sacred temple, and then we identify with them and we give them more force and send them out with renewed energy. So we have to keep an eye. First, we have to begin to be aware of our thoughts and emotions, and when we see that they enter our field, we don't take ownership of them. We just watch them and let them go. They will stay for a little while, and if we don't extend our hand, they will leave. While they are there, you are not really thinking them. They are there just because they are part of the environment, the common consciousness of humanity. If you don't take ownership, they will leave without leaving a trace. So that is the first step. And then with training, it's very easy. I mean, of course, there are always thoughts that are difficult to shake off. But in relative terms, it's very easy when we recognize a thought that is not worth the sacred temple. It's very easy just to drop it. You don't even have to pay much attention to it. You generated a kind of space between you and the thoughts that you see and you drop it. So this is a first skill we have to achieve before we enter the path of occultism, before we can become conscious co-workers of humanity. So the voice of the silence goes on saying, if thou wouldst not be slain by them, by the thoughts, then must thou harmless make thy own creations. So we have to work on this purification so that the thoughts that come out of us are harmless. The children of thy thoughts, unseen, impalpable, that swarm round humankind, the progeny and heirs to man and his terrestrial spoils. So we have to make them harmless, and eventually we have to make them an active force for good. Okay, I think we can stop here. There are a few more things, but we can do it after the break. I have 2 or 3 more slides that show this idea of emanations from a slightly different point of view. But I think the main idea in this talk is that we are part of the hierarchies. We have all the powers of the hierarchies. We have first to purify ourselves. We have then to awaken these powers so that we can become a co-worker of nature. And probably one of the first steps is to begin to work on our psychology, our emotions, our thoughts, so that the hierarchies we are constantly emanating can become a force for good and not for evil. Thank you.